of course, but we justified the insanity with biblical passages and with the examples of the Greeks and Romans and with outright racism, arguing that black people were inherently inferior to whites and that not to keep them in slavery would upset the natural order of things, a worldview popularized millennia ago by my nemesis, Aristotle. God, I hate Aristotle. You know what defenders of Aristotle always say? He was the first person to identify dolphins. Well, okay. Dolphin identifier. Yes, that is what he should be remembered for, but he's a terrible philosopher. Here's the truth about slavery. It was coerced labor that relied upon intimidation and brutality and dehumanization. And this wasn't just a cultural system, it was a legal one. I mean, Louisiana law proclaimed that a slave owes his master a respect without bounds and an absolute obedience. The signal feature of slaves' lives was work. I mean, conditions and tasks varied, but all slaves labored usually from sunup to sundown and almost always without any pay. Most slaves worked in agriculture on plantations, and conditions were different depending on which crops were grown. Like slaves on the rice plantations of South Carolina had terrible working conditions, but they labored under the task system, which meant that once they had completed their allotted daily work, they would have time to do other things. But lest you imagine this is like how we have work and leisure time, bear in mind that they were owned and treated as property. On cotton plantation, most slaves worked in gangs, usually under the control of an overseer or another slave who was called a driver. This was back-breaking work done in the southern sun and humidity, and so it's not surprising that whippings or the threat of them were often necessary to get slaves to work. It's easy enough to talk about the brutality of slave discipline, but it can be difficult to internalize it. Like, you look at these pictures, but because you've seen them over and over again, they don't have the power they once might have. The pictures can tell a story about cruelty, but they don't necessarily communicate how arbitrary it all was, as, for example, in this story told by a woman who was a slave as a young girl. The overseer went to my father one morning and said, "Bob, I'm gonna whip you this morning." Daddy said, "I ain't done nothing." And he said, "I know it. I'm gonna whip you to keep you from doing nothing." And he hit him with that cowhide. You know, it would cut the blood out of you with every lick if they hit you hard. That brutality, the whippings, the brandings, the rape, was real, and it was intentional because in order for slavery to function, slaves had to be dehumanized. This enabled slaveholders to rationalize what they were doing, and it was hoped to reduce slaves to the animal property that is implied by the term chattel slavery. So the idea was that slaveholders wouldn't think of their slaves as human, and slaves wouldn't think of themselves as human. But it didn't work. Let's go to the thought bubble. Slaves' resistance to their dehumanization took many forms, but the primary way was by forming families. Family was a refuge for slaves and a source of dignity that masters recognized and sought to stifle. A paternalistic slave owner named Bennett H. Barrow wrote in his Rules for the Highland Plantation, "No rule that I have stated is of more importance than that relating to Negroes marrying outside of the plantation. It creates a feeling of independence." Most slaves did marry, usually for life, and when possible, slaves grew up in two-parent households. Single-parent households were common, though, as a result of one parent being sold. In the Upper South, where the economy was shifting from tobacco to different, less labor-intensive cash crops, the sale of slaves was common. Perhaps 1/3 of slave marriages in states like Virginia were broken up by sale. Religion was also an important part of life in slavery. While masters wanted their slaves to learn the parts of the Bible that talked about being happy in bondage, slave worship tended to focus on the stories of Exodus, where Moses brought the slaves out of bondage, or biblical heroes who overcame great odds like Daniel and David. And although most slaves were forbidden to learn to read and write, many did anyway, and some became preachers. Slave preachers were often very charismatic leaders, and they roused the suspicion of slave owners, and not without reason. Two of the most important slave uprisings in the South were led by preachers. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? We're doing 2 set pieces in a row? All right. The rules here are simple. I wanted to reshoot that, but Stan said no. I guess the author of the mystery document. If I am wrong, I get shocked with the shock pen. Since I have been in the Queen's dominions, I have been well contented. Yes, well contented for sure. Man is as God intended he should be. That is, all are born free and equal. This is a wholesome law, not like the Southern laws, which puts man made in the image of God on level with brutes. Oh, what will become of the people, and where will they stand in the day of judgment? Would that the 5th verse of the 3rd chapter of Malachi were written as with a bar of iron and the point of a diamond upon every oppressor's heart, that they might repent of this evil and let the oppressed go free. All right, it's definitely a preacher, because only preachers have read Malachi. Probably African American, probably not someone from the South. I'm going to guess that it is Richard Allen, the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Ah, dang! Dang it! It's Joseph Taper, and Stan just pointed out to me that I should have known it was Joseph Taper because it starts out, since I have been in the Queen's dominions. He was in Canada. He escaped slavery to Canada, the Queen's dominions. All right, Canadians, I blame you for this, although thank you for abolishing slavery decades before we did. So the mystery document shows one of the primary ways that slaves resisted their oppression, by running away. Although some slaves, like Joseph Taper, escaped slavery for good by running away to northern free states or even to Canada, where they wouldn't have to worry about fugitive slave laws, even more slaves ran away temporarily, hiding out in the woods or the swamps and eventually returning. No one knows exactly how many slaves escaped to freedom, but the best estimate is that 1,000 or so a year made the journey northward. Most fugitive slaves were young men, but the most famous runaway has been hanging out behind me all day long: Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman escaped to Philadelphia at the age of 29, and over the course of her life, she made about 20 trips back to Maryland to help friends and relatives make the journey north on the Underground Railroad. But a more dramatic form of resistance to slavery was actual armed rebellion, which was attempted. Now, individuals sometimes took matters into their own hands and beat or even killed their white overseers or masters, like Bob, the guy who received the arbitrary beating, responded to it by killing his overseer with a hoe. But that said, large-scale slave uprisings were relatively rare. The four most famous ones all took place in a 35-year period at the beginning of the 19th century. Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800, which we talked about before, was discovered before he was able to carry out his plot. Then in 1811, a group of slaves upriver from New Orleans seized cane knives and guns and marched on the city before militia stopped them. And in 1822, Denmark Vesey, a former slave who had purchased his freedom, may have organized a plot to destroy Charleston, South Carolina. I say may have because the evidence against him is disputed and comes from a trial that was not fair. But regardless, the end result of that trial is that he was executed, as were 34 slaves. But the most successful slave rebellion, at least in the sense that they actually killed some people, was Nat Turner's in August 1831. Turner was a preacher, and with a group of about 80 slaves, he marched from farm to farm in Southampton County, Virginia, killing the inhabitants, most of whom were women and children because the men were attending a religious revival meeting in North Carolina.